The understanding of happiness among humans is rather misguided. They often think that long-term contentment can be found in the eyes of a lover, in the fruits of one's labor, or in the raw passion that seethes from a work of art. Yet spouses die and cheat. What is a dream job becomes unsustainable, or worse, mundane. And even great works of art get buried beneath the creative products of the billions of other souls searching for their own piece of spiritual fulfillment. Sustainable joy isn't a target that is hit and then pays back in perpetuity. It's the feeling, a year from now, on a Wednesday afternoon, where the contentment is just strong enough to stop you from asking the question of whether you're happy to begin with. Pavel Ryba was conceived in the confused afterglow of the Second World War. The Nazis had been defeated. Hitler had splattered the walls of his underground bunker with the remnants of his sentience, and Czechoslovakia was a free country once more. Yet, as the clump of cells in Mrs. Ryba's womb slowly attained personhood, the country strayed away from the freedom it had fought for. Election results were adapted to a new political reality. Voices which called for democracy were pushed out of windows, and by the time Pavel emerged, screaming into the world, he was living in another state, which bowed down to a cruel foreign master. The Soviets might have used a different nomenclature than the Nazis to justify the suffering that they spread through Europe, yet they were just as willing to sacrifice millions of innocent lives to keep the machinery of their empire running. It was difficult to have a happy childhood when the country was descending into totalitarianism. There were rules, far too many rules for a young boy to follow. There were things he couldn't talk about, things he couldn't ask, dreams he wasn't allowed to dream. It was difficult to understand why his mother would cry when listening to the radio in the evenings, or why his father had broken down when the police wanted to ask about his brother. The young boy lived in a world that would confuse even an adult. As Pavel grew older, however, he slowly started to understand. His parents spoke of show trials, which were used by the communists to execute their political rivals. Family gatherings were filled with hushed whispers of uprisings crushed by tanks. The country in which he was living was choking beneath the boot of totalitarianism, and any cries for help were punished with additional pressure to the neck. Things were steadily growing worse, but things seldom grow worse unopposed. Socialism with a human face is what they called it. If the state was truly the utopia that the government propaganda suggested, then what was the harm in loosening the travel restrictions? In allowing artists to say what was truly on their mind? Wouldn't a perfect society benefit from a free press? Pavel and his university cohorts believed that real structural change was possible. The idealism that festered in the youth bounced joyfully through the cold streets of Prague and brought forth a warm spring drenched in hope and rock and roll. Yet even the most optimistic of smiles falter at the presence of foreign tanks. On the night of August 20th, 1968, 250,000 troops invaded Czechoslovakia under the orders of the Soviet Union. Within hours, the boot of totalitarianism snuffed out the spirit of hope that had been building for months. Even those among the Czechs who had thought of the Soviets as their brethren had to admit that they were not living in a partnership. They were occupied by a superpower that was willing to crush them just to send out a message to the other satellite states. Freedom was not a choice. Some did not accept defeat. Pavel's classmates vowed to fight the system in any way that they could, through letters and charters and smuggling. They would chip away at the power of their oppressors and meddle in their affairs until the time was right to break the chains. Others chose to work within the system, to accept things as they were, and try to pry as much joy out of the life that they were forced to live. They'd join the party, maybe sign some condemnations, let a couple words slip about their neighbors. The system would repay their moral flexibility with perks. If one could gain the trust of the machinery, their kids would have guaranteed university spots. One could travel for vacations. A half-decent life could be provided for those who helped the oppressors. Pavel's friends flowed into the two opposing groups, but he could do neither. He couldn't imagine cooperating with the same people who ran tanks through the borders of his country and hung political opponents. There was no way that he would join the Communist Party. He didn't have the moral flexibility. Yet at the same rate, Pavel couldn't imagine committing to a lifetime of fighting a mammoth enemy that could not be defeated. He was not brave enough to stand up against a system that held all of the cards. He didn't want to throw away his future to make a statement. He didn't want to end up in jail. He didn't want to end up dead. He didn't know what he wanted. Weeks after the invasion, as everyone around him picked their lot in life, Pavel set out on a walk. He didn't have a specific path when he set out, he just let his feet guide him. All that he wanted to do was to get out of his crummy apartment and as far from the nagging question of his future as he could. Pavel walked out of the anxious city, past the construction sites for the new housing projects and into the woods that drizzled the edges of Prague. The forest path was calmer. Being away from the constant ringing of trams and chatter of pedestrians did him good, but his mind was still occupied with worry. The air was cool in the shade of the trees, and unseen birds chirped happily in the distance, but Pavel still worried about the future. All of those thoughts disappeared the moment he saw the reservoir. The structure was man-made, but the only thing that suggested the unnatural touch was a cement shack that housed the water valves. From the moment he saw it, Pavel couldn't think of the reservoir in front of him as anything but a work of nature. To him, it was a pond with shimmering water and swaying reeds and the occasional hint of fish. His worries about the future were gone. There were no barbed wire borders or tanks or human rights violations. The only thing that mattered at that moment, the only thing that truly existed, was that gem of tranquil blue lying in a sea of grass. He sat down at the edge of the pond and let the perfection of the place wash over him like a soothing salve. The fabric of time itself stretched and shrunk at the otherworldly beauty of the pond. Each moment that he spent sitting by the water seemed to drag on into eternity. Yet by the time the sun set, by the time he had to look back and acknowledge that he had spent an entire day in a strange clearing in the woods, it all seemed to have passed in a snap. It was getting dark. He needed to go home. As he stumbled his way back through the blackening woods, Pavel passed an old wooden cottage that was nestled just a stone's throw away from the clearing. By the time he reached Prague's city limits, his mind was made up. He had a calling. That pond had awoken something in him. So much of his life was uncertain. But the one thing Pavel knew was that he would become the owner of that cottage by the pond. After finishing off his studies, Pavel became a ticket inspector on the city's public transport. Pavel's days would be spent shuffling through the miserable rush-hour crowds on the trams, and eventually the subway. The badge that he carried looked more like a piece of scrap metal rather than a seal of authority, but the passengers never complained. In fact, they never talked. He would flash his badge, they would show their tickets, and if they didn't have them, they would present their identification for a fine or run. Pavel never chased the ones that ran. His mind was elsewhere. Whenever one of his colleagues was tasked with inspecting tickets on the bus routes that hugged the edges of the city, Pavel did his best to swap shifts. It was easier for him to get home after work, he told his colleagues. This was a half-truth. Pavel's apartment was deep within the heart of Prague, yet he felt more at home at the pond. As soon as his shift was done, Pavel would walk out through the woods, sit down by the water, and just take in its majestic beauty. After a couple years of saving and greasing palms that disliked the concept of private ownership, Pavel bought the rundown cottage on the edge of the pond. Most of the routes that Pavel had to work involved the newly built subway in the center, or the trams that crossed through the more historical parts of town. But after work, Pavel would always return to his personal slice of heaven. For the better part of 20 years, Pavel spent every spare moment of his life sitting by the edge of the pond, soaking in the tranquility that his little paradise provided. There was no need for family or friends or hobbies. He had his pond, and that was all that mattered. Meanwhile, the people of Czechoslovakia lived through the totalitarian system that was forced upon them. The communists kept an iron grip on the country, but no grip lasts forever. Charters were signed, political prisoners were abused, protests were organized, and before the party could realize what was happening, the entire country turned against it. This time, there would be no tanks. The Soviets were far too preoccupied with the fallout from Afghanistan, with the pressure from the West, with the other satellite states getting similar ideas of freedom. The bloodless revolution started on November 16, 1989, and before the 80s ended, the country was free. The trams and subways and buses that Pavel rode during the days of the uprising were tense with anticipation. When the revolution was over, they were bright with excitement for a new future, and even after freedom had lost its novelty, they still bathed in the afterglow of victory. He was happy. Who wouldn't be? But the burst of joy that he got from seeing the evil system of his childhood defeated paled in the soft, reliable contentment he got from his pond. Pavel celebrated the crumbling of the Soviet Empire by working the transport track for a couple more years and then retiring to his cabin in the woods. Buying a fishing rod was the most radical thing that Pavel did in the first 5 years of retirement. Fishing seemed like the type of thing that men in retirement do, and Pavel wanted to throw in a pinch of normalcy into his pond-focused life. But the main reason why he picked up the hobby was because he was scared of the fish overpopulating and starving. Pavel couldn't let anything happen to the pond. The fish were his friends. They were his only friends. As the 21st century crawled into existence, the edges of the city stretched past the old Soviet housing projects. First came the weekend cyclists, then the adventurous dog owners, and finally, the joggers. Within a couple of years, Pavel's private pond had become a piece of nature that he had to share with the neighborhood. The screaming children were annoying, and the drunks from the barbecues who wanted to talk about fishing were a pain, but Pavel would manage to block them out on most days. His life had become one extended fishing trip. The pond was enthralling enough to let him shut out the outside world. But happiness based on external factors rarely lasts forever. They showed up at his door wearing face masks and offering food. At first he thought they were some sort of Christian sect, but after some explanation they revealed themselves to be volunteers. Did he not wonder why people had stopped coming to the reservoir? Did he not notice the woods being exceptionally quiet? Did he not hear about the pandemic? Pavel didn't. He never got a radio or a television. There was no need for it. Who needed the news when you could just watch the calm ripples of the pond? The volunteers brought Pavel supplies and would continue to do so over the coming weeks of the pandemic. He was, after all, a senior citizen who shouldn't be risking his life going on grocery trips. The optimistic volunteers told him that the lockdown would last 2 weeks. The ones who had learned cynicism in their voices said it would last longer. Pavel didn't mind. He had his pond. The term senior citizen did, however, get caught in the back of his head. In Pavel's mind, he was still the same young man who in '68 had stumbled upon a magical place in the woods to escape Soviet tanks. Everything that happened after that point of his life was just one protracted fishing trip, with real-life responsibilities thrown in for a gentle note of conflict. As the quarantine dragged past its 2-week benchmark, however, Pavel started to realize that maybe his years were getting to him. He started hearing voices. It was a gentle rumble in the back of his head at first, but as the days went on, those voices grew louder and louder. Sometimes they cast doubt about his choice to commit his life to the pond. At other times, they poked at the potential loneliness that foregoing family for a life of fishing might bring. But every time, they were direct about what he was meant to do. He was meant to leave the pond. He managed to shut out that foreign internal monologue that bounced around his skull, but from the moment he had first heard those whispers, something had changed about the pond. It seemed different. The door of the concrete shack that held the water valves was kicked off its hinges. Someone had been draining the reservoir. Pavel put everything back in its place, chalked up the loosened valves to teenagers bored in lockdown, and went back to enjoy his pond. The voices didn't like him doing that. They howled and ordered him to leave the pond. They spoke of 100-eyed God. But Pavel chose to ignore them. He had lived long enough to get good at ignoring things, yet the situation quickly deteriorated. Soon, he wasn't alone. Joggers started running around his pond much like they did before the pandemic, but these joggers were not the usual peppy people with Fitbits and toned bodies. The joggers that ran around his pond were exhausted shells of people, drenched in sweat. They were all far too out of shape to be going on regular runs that deep into the woods, yet they pushed their bodies past their breaking points. They ran around the pond, they ran into the forest, they emerged with weighed-down plastic bags as the wheezing joggers ran across the meadow. Pavel tried to ignore them and keep his eyes on the water. But he couldn't ignore them. The water from the reservoir was being drained again. When Pavel came back to the concrete shack, all thought of the water being drained by harmless teens dissipated. The culprit stood right by the valves, one of the sunken-eyed joggers. Pavel tried to reason with him, to ask him why he would want to drain the beautiful pond and harm all the innocent fish that lived within, but the jogger wouldn't listen. He only spoke of 100-eyed God. He wanted Pavel to leave the pond. The voices in Pavel's head echoed the sentiment. They thundered with a power that whisked away any chance of them being simple senility or neuroticism. The jogger became violent. The paramedics found him at the gate to one of the new suburban developments near the forest. Unconscious, covered in mud and bleeding from the head, the dog walker who called the ambulance feared the worst. Yet after being inspected at the hospital, Pavel's head trauma proved to be a simple scrape. The man was in remarkably good shape for his years. The hospital kept him overnight for closer observation, but the doctor told Pavel he didn't have to worry about any long-lasting trauma. He barely heard her. Pavel was too busy thinking about the pond. He knew something was wrong. Somewhere in the depths of his soul, he knew something had happened with the pond. Outside, the stars shone like 1,000 shapeless eyes, and the air was thick with tension. Whatever had wanted out of the pond was a force beyond Pavel's comprehension. After hours of watching the night sky, trying to understand what had happened over the past couple of weeks, Pavel decided to go to sleep. Maybe there was a rational explanation for everything. Maybe the pond was okay. Maybe he was simply going mad. He was set to leave the hospital the next day. The sooner he slept, the sooner he would get closure. He didn't. It was a horrid series of visions. His pond was gone. In its place was a muddy crater filled with dead fish. A crowd gathered around the corpse of his love, with hollow expressions stared down into the hole and chanted, "He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he shall walk the earth. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon his eyes shall judge our souls. He has seen us. He has seen the work. Soon he will arrive." The fish started to flop. Their scales rhythmically rose and fell as if they were grasping for breath, as if they were coming back to life. But they weren't. Their scales ripped apart to free their soft pink flesh. Strings of fish guts all moved towards the center of the pond and amassed themselves into... His heartbeat was deafening. Pavel awoke in the middle of a dark hospital room in a cold sweat. He scarcely understood where he was, but he knew two things. His pond was gone, and he was having a heart attack. Pavel was lucky he was already in the hospital. Pavel wasn't as fortuitous with the heart attack as he was with head trauma. He was lucky enough to survive, but even after a week of being kept in the hospital, he felt like most of his energy had been sapped away from him. Suddenly, he wasn't just a continuation of that young man who'd stumbled into a hidden paradise during an invasion. Now he was an old man nearing his final days. The old man hobbled onto a bus and rode out to the edge of the city. The ticket checker didn't ask for his ticket. Pavel looked like a feeble centenarian, and people over 70 rode for free. He shuffled his feet through the dark forest path that led to his meadow. Pavel kept on hoping that the horrible vision he had was simply a product of a colorful imagination, or a precursor to his heart problems. But he failed to convince himself. The day was cloudy, and there was very little light at the end of the tunnel of trees. He knew something horrible happened that night. He wept. For the first time since the arrival of the Soviet tanks, Pavel wept. Everything that had made him happy in his life was gone. The air of tranquility, that intoxicating aroma of the woods, it was all gone. In its stead was mud and the smell of rot. The bottom of the reservoir was filled with the same blank-eyed fishbone he had seen in his dream. Yet among them was something shiny. Even in his grief-stricken state, it caught his eye. Among the finely picked corpses of his animal friends, there was a smartphone. A voice cut through his grief.
"You should check on that phone,"
it said. The voice sounded familiar. It was the same voice he had heard in his mind during the early days of the lockdown. But there was something different about it. It was weak. It was diminished in some primal way.
"You should check on that phone,"
the voice repeated. Pavel found himself walking to the edge of the pond. He tried to carefully descend the slope, but his shaky legs were no match for the mud. He fell, he bounced, something cracked. Pain. He lay there on a jagged pile of fish bones, grasping for breaths that wouldn't come. The grey skies above him were nothing like the pale blue of his youth. It started to rain. His heart started to ache again. Yet before he could fully explore the possibility of another heart attack, something else grabbed Pavel's attention. The corner of his mouth. Something was trying to crawl past his lips. It reeked of rotten fish. He tore at the mysterious creature, did whatever he could to keep it from crawling into his mouth, yet its soft, fleshy tentacles slipped past his fingers like Play-Doh. The old man shook with panic. Everything he had cared about was gone. He was dying, and now there was something trying to crawl into his mouth that tasted like rancid Chinese food. His heart was filled with pain and fear, yet it all ended in an instant. A wave of calm swept through the old man. A familiar calm. As soon as the tentacles had made it past a certain point of his throat, it was as if Pavel was reborn. The rave of tranquility was the same one that the reservoir had provided. But where the pond rippled, the rotten fish created a tsunami. As the 100-eyed god took control of Pavel's body, his mind was drenched in a serene peace. He doesn't go out much now. The pond is a bone-filled husk of what it used to be. and all the stomping joggers of the quarantine have killed off any semblance of plant life. Pavel simply sits in his cottage and browses the internet on the smartphone he found at the bottom of the pond. There is just so much Golden Age television and Reddit posts and YouTube series about crime-fighting dinosaurs that he is yet to consume. That the 100-eyed god is to consume, that is. Pavel has become an eldritch finger puppet for a force more powerful than he could ever comprehend. The 100-eyed god needed a vessel with thumbs to let him browse the internet, and Pavel had thumbs. It's not like he had a lot going on anyway. But Pavel is being repaid for his service to the 100-eyed god. From the depths of his stomach, he is being fed pure, long-lasting happiness. His pond might be gone, but happiness gained from external things rarely lasts. Happiness comes from inside. Some say that he still sits at his cottage until this very day. The old man just sits there, scrolling and streaming and reading and watching, all in the service of the 100-eyed god.
The 100-Eyed God was written and produced by me, Mike Jesus Langer, and has featured the voices of Sam Barlien, Jen Kirk, Grax Bishop, Dr.Creepen, Nikolai Shevchik, Alyssa Dillard, and Steffi Wright. Music by Petra Mrdian, The Dark Side of Music, and Frederick Chopin, with art by Teresa Kolajikova. The series might be over, but there's still going to be oodles of spooky stuff coming to their channel. Stay tuned for new stories every Tuesday and Friday, and maybe, just maybe, you might find out what Pavel Ryba is up to these days. Thank you for listening, hope you're doing well, and I'm looking forward to bringing you more fever dreams in the near future.